Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Scary Stories NYC. I'm your old pal Bigfoot. This episode we've got 2 hours of all Dogman stories, most of which were sent in by you viewers and adapted by us to our format. People ask us if our stories are true, and for the most part, we don't really know. People tell us the stories are true a lot of the time, but they almost always ask to be anonymous, and we don't have the resources to go to the locations involved or question witnesses, so it's possible people are trolling us for fun a lot of the time. On the other hand, I'm not about to go start calling people liars either. We're stuck in this position where we don't want to get in trouble with YouTube for claiming monsters are real, which they might label as fake news, but we don't want to disagree with or disrespect our viewers either. So let's say these are allegedly true accounts, but we're presenting our versions for entertainment purposes only. Once in a while, though, we get a brave soul who actually wants to use his name when we tell the tale of their scary cryptid encounter. Case in point, Daquan from our comments section sent us the first story today. It's a very brief encounter but interesting, and it seems it happened to Daquan and his sister. Daquan wants to call this one the White-Eyed Dogman. Rock Hill, South Carolina is a place where 60 or 70,000 people live. Not the biggest city in the world, but you would think it would be too populated a place for anyone to report seeing a Dogman. You would be wrong. Daquan and his sister were outside in their neighborhood, walking on Baker Street, which he notes is located near the local elementary school. It was midnight, but there was the usual ambient lighting you'd find on most suburban streets in the middle of the night. Looking at this image from Google Maps, you can see how the blocks consist of houses on either side, separated by small, mini forests of trees to separate the properties. Well, right at the edge of the tree line of one of those small patches of woods, Daquan and his sister saw something unlike anything they had ever seen before. There was enough light available for them to clearly make out a very tall figure standing there, but it was dark enough that they noted a very strange kind of eye shine being emitted by it. It appeared to be a man-like figure, but this man was too tall to be human. It stood 7 feet from its toes to the tip of its wolf-like ears, and its eyes glowed a bright white. The shape of the head was wolf-like, and also reminded them of a German shepherd, but neither wolves nor German shepherds stand around at midnight on their hind legs. Daquan and his sister knew they were seeing something out of the ordinary. Being familiar with Dogman lore, Daquan was bothered by the white eye shine. He had heard that Dogman has eye shine colored anywhere from yellow to orange, amber, to even red, depending on the story. These eyes appeared to reflect a bright white, closer to some kinds of cats than to the legendary Dogman. But what if it wasn't a Dogman, but a different kind of legendary creature instead? Skeptics might be asking how a predator that large could survive in a tiny woods between houses in the suburbs, and the answer, of course, is that it couldn't. But if we pull back and get a somewhat broader view of the area, we can see that there are a number of small woods, all connected to each other, and in turn connecting to larger wooded areas. It isn't impossible something could have wandered in from the wilderness into this place, especially if it were a migratory kind of creature. On the other hand, Daquan thinks he and his sister may have noticed an odd thing about the entity that might make the question of habitat a moot point. As unnerving as you can imagine this situation being, Daquan felt an extra unease as he realized that Dogman was looking at him as though he knew him. I don't know what that means exactly, but he clearly had a sense that this creature was already familiar with both of them. What if it wasn't a wild animal at all? What if this was a real-life manifestation of the legendary and mythical werewolf? A werewolf in South Carolina, and on top of that, one that already knew Daquan and his family? To quote him directly, Daquan says, "Now you and the viewers may be asking, how would the Dogman recognize you if it's a walking deadly machine? It wouldn't know you from a can of paint." Well, here's my theory. I believe it could have been someone in our family that has transformed to this intelligent, scary-looking creature. Well, if you're related to Daquan, don't feel insulted. He did call the monster intelligent, so no disrespect to you, cousin Dogman. Seriously though, Daquan says that as they stood frozen, staring in shock at the dog-headed man, they could see it had something in its hand. Almost as soon as they were able to make that realization, the Dogman threw whatever it was in their general direction. Not being able to see where the object was flying, they held their position and heard something heavy land nearby. Possibly it was a stone or rock that had been thrown. They both held their ground, but the creature ran off into the woods and was gone in a flash. With a chill sent deep through them, Daquan and his sister both ran inside and locked every door and window in the place. They were safe for now, but they were no closer to solving the mystery of who or what they actually saw. Was it a wild animal? Was it a werewolf? If it was a werewolf, could it have been a friend or family member? Someone they knew well in their human form? So far at least, Daquan and his sister have no answers, because at the time of this recording, that was the last time they ever saw the white-eyed Dogman. Thanks for that story, Daquan. You and your family keep safe out there in South Carolina. Stay tuned, everybody. We've got 2 hours of scary Dogman stories coming up right after this.
I'm PQ Ribber. Join me and Dr. Death for a new cryptid each week on Monday Night Monsters on Scary Stories NYC.
One of our viewers named Mary was writing to us in the comments last night saying she wished we could go back to doing this thing we used to do in the past on this channel. We used to end the stories a lot of the time with Bigfoot or Dogman or whatever monster was in that story jumping up and making a loud monster sound at you. It was a lot of fun for people who like fun, but to everyone else, I was doing something that violated some policy or another somewhere, so we would get punished from on high for doing it. Nevertheless, Mary misses that, and I sort of do too, so tonight I'm warning you in advance that we will do that at the very end of this story. I'm going to mix the monster sound down so it shouldn't be too scary, and hopefully won't get us demonetized again, but we'll do it to say thanks to Mary for having listened to us for so long. Now for today's story, which is a very unique one. At least I've never heard a story like it. I don't know what to think about it, as it raises questions about the very nature of our reality. And I find the ideas in it unsettling and disquieting. Assuming there's any truth to any of this, it might be something deep to ponder, or it might be fiction created by a troll. We'll leave it for you to decide, like on that old Jonathan Frakes show, okay? And we're going to title it with the musical question, did my sister accidentally summon Dogman? Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story to tell you about my teenage years that involves the Dogman. Although we didn't think of it in those terms back when it happened, we thought of them as some kind of hairy demonic form at the time, but that was because of the context. For that reason, I suppose I'd better fill in the background first so that you can comprehend the details of the monster sightings and interactions that various members of my family claimed happened to them. This was the early 1970s, and we lived in a quiet suburban town in New Jersey. Some of my family still lives there, so I don't want to get more specific than that. I was 13, and my 17-year-old sister was getting involved in some stuff that teenagers were very into back in that era. She couldn't handle it very well, though, and she had made some bad friends, so very soon this situation occurred where she stopped going with us to church on Sundays. For this reason, let's call her Vampirella for the purpose of this narrative. Not the copyrighted Vampirella, like change a letter or two and I think it'll be kosher. She would dress all in black, and this was years before punk rock started. She was sort of proto-goth or pre-emo. Anyway, Mom and Dad refused to search her room or invade her privacy, but I heard them discussing things of that nature. They were very relaxed in their raising of us, and this was the first time any of the family had started keeping secrets. One time, I heard her chanting some kind of devil prayer in her room. I didn't know if it was a real prayer to evil, or if she was just reading the liner notes from a heavy metal album. I wasn't sure if it was just my sister going through a teenage fad, or if something actually bad was happening. I knew she didn't like me anymore, and we had stopped being friends. I had started finding her intimidating, and the large young men she hung out with even more so. I heard Mom tell Dad that the only reason she hadn't kicked my sister out was that she knew she'd end up moving in with one of those guys, and she might be in genuine danger if she did that. So one day when Vampirella ran into the house and slammed the door behind her, screaming that there was a monster chasing her, we all rolled our eyes. I didn't even stop doing my homework. I could only imagine all the reasons she might think she was seeing monsters, and even at that young age, I didn't bother to look out the window to see if the monster was real. I knew it wasn't. She described what she saw, and I doodled a drawing of what she was describing in my notebook that afternoon. It was a big man, covered in hair, but he was a devil, with a long fang-filled snout and claws instead of hands. His legs were like goat legs. She told us he had an insane expression and moved faster than any man she'd ever seen. She described it as 7 feet tall one time and 8 feet tall another time, so we all just chalked it up to a strange hallucination. She was not a good advertisement for quitting church to me in my impressionable youth. She made being straight and square look cool by comparison, if you know what I mean. She was kind of a mess, and we did not know how to help her. The Dogman sightings became more frequent, and by now she had taken to calling them demon sightings. My father wanted her to see a shrink that he offered to pay for. She felt they would declare her schizo, which I think they might have, so she wouldn't go. She didn't want to be given meds that would make her demons go away. She wanted to find some way to coexist with them. One time she came home and we saw her in her old beat-up car, sitting in the driver's seat in front of the house, but she didn't come in. We couldn't see anyone else in her car from our vantage point and chalked it up to ever more bizarre behavior on her part. Our house was built so that you had to walk up a flight of steps outside to get to the front door. We actually mainly lived upstairs, and we had our bedrooms down in what we called the basement, which was actually only sunk about 3 feet deep into the earth. You could only enter the quote-unquote basement from upstairs, or maybe if you could climb through one of the ground level windows we had. So we were on the main floor upstairs, actually elevated 1 floor above the earth, and we were looking down past the stairs to Vampirella out parked on the street in her car. She, in turn, was staring toward the front of the house beneath us and a bit to our right. After about a half hour, my mother went out onto the front stoop to see what was up, and then my sister got out of her car and came inside. When we asked her what that was all about, she said one of the demons was at the bottom of the stairs out front, out of our line of vision. It wasn't letting her into the house, but when my mother went outside, it got spooked and ran off. I remember her talking about how the demon had devil legs, bent backward like goat legs, but they had a man's torso and a dog's head. It was only in much more recent times, when I rediscovered my childhood notebook, that I saw my sketch of what my sister claimed was haunting her. It was a childlike sketch of what we would now call a Dogman. It reached the point where old Vampirella agreed to stop praying to the devil for a while so we could try to cleanse the house and the surrounding land and maybe drive her demons off. My dad had this complicated theory that if Vampy was seeing these dogmen because of her belief system and rituals she had performed, then if we did rituals to the opposite of hers, positive where she was negative, and if we overdid hers by a large enough magnitude, we could undo with our imagination what she had done with hers. We wanted to also get her on board if possible. The only other alternative would be for her to move, and nobody wanted that. She was not stable at the time, and if she left, we all felt she might never come back. So Vampy chilled out a little and traded her Ouija board to a friend for the game of life. She didn't start going to church with us on Sunday again, but I believed her when she said she had stopped praying to devils. She seemed to genuinely want the demons to stop haunting her. My mother invited our pastor to come and pray at the house. My father invited a nearby priest to bless the house and land with holy water. They both went and met with a native shaman who visited us and performed mystifying rituals everywhere. My parents had Vampy there to watch and experience all of this, hoping it would help her to stop seeing the Dogman. Remember that none of the rest of us had seen what she had seen, but still, we were all willing to go through all of this to get her well again and to bring her back to the family and to her own happiness. Things quieted down quickly after that, but my sister somehow grew even more distant, and she moved away less than a year afterward. We all lost touch with her and had no idea what was going on for literally decades. In the late 1990s, my father contacted me on the phone, and he was sounding really weird. He kept beating around the bush instead of coming out with the reason he was calling me. I think he was either embarrassed or maybe doubting his own sanity, but eventually he admitted to me that he was calling because he had seen a hairy, dog-headed man lurking in the woods just outside our property. That was the word he used, lurking. I asked him to describe specifically what he saw, and he said it was a man-like hairy mammal or perhaps marsupial, which he could see standing bipedally in profile. It was bent forward, hiding behind a bush, looking out at birds on the grass, who appeared to be eating grass seed or worms or something. It had weird-shaped devil legs like a goat, and it had a long tail. It had pointed ears on top of its head like a wolf, and a long dog snout. It was dark and shaggy all over, and it looked taller than a normal man. He was right. That was what my sister had been claiming to see. I wondered if my father was now losing his mind in the same way my sister had. Maybe it was genetic. The idea of that scared me. Then again, maybe this was proof that my sister had not been schizo after all. Maybe she really was seeing big dog-headed monsters, which she interpreted as demons. And that was the other obvious possibility. These creatures might be real and demons. My father was not okay about this. He was really shaken and unable to function. My mother called me several times asking me to come home and help her with him because his mental state was growing worse. I made arrangements to get some time off from my job, and I went home to stay at my parents' house. At first, we just talked about stuff. Then, he took me to where he had seen the creature. We looked behind the bush in question, and although we did not see prints of any kind, the grass was worn away back there, as though something had stood there frequently and recently. We tried to contact that old shaman, but it turned out he had passed. We had someone else recommended to us, and he came out to visit our land and hear our stories. He said that if we saw the monster at the edge of our property, but not inside it, that was in a sense a good sign, because it meant that the blessings we had received from the various faiths years earlier were still holding. But it also seemed to indicate there was a disturbance in the outer world of our family, most likely related to Vampirella. Dad hired a private detective to find her, and after some time he did. I think this was 1998 or 1999. I remember the day she came home. She was older, but she was still the same old proto-goth kind of character. She still wore all black all the time, still acted like a teenager, even though she must have been 40 by that point. Vampy revealed that she had been living on the other side of the state, not very far away at all. She confirmed that she had recently been dumped by her boyfriend of 12 years and had been going through a dark time, thinking about the idea of coming home to her parents. That was sort of what the native shaman dude had suggested to us. She slept over that night, as did I, and we all talked enthusiastically before bedtime about how great it was to all be back together. I think we might have actually meant it, but I'm not sure. In the night, I was awakened by a sound I thought I heard. I wasn't sure if I had dreamed it or not, but it sounded like something roaring. I sat up in bed and listened closely. I figured it had to have been a dream, but I waited and listened anyway. It sounded like something was happening outside, but I wasn't sure what. I jumped out of bed and headed for the stairs up to the main level, where I was met by my father and sister. Seeing each other, we instantly understood that we had not dreamed that sound. Our faces carried fear, concern, confusion, and annoyance as we ran upstairs. There, looking through the window into the dining room, was the most horrifying thing I ever hoped to see. This was something from a nightmare. I looked again at my sister and father to reassure myself that I wasn't the only one seeing this. My father looked the most terrified. My sister was crying and seemed sad more than scared. I could relate to all they were feeling, and so many more strange and unwelcome things. My mother ran into the room with her camera and gasped as she saw what we saw. She tried to take photos, but when we eventually got them developed, we could only see glare on the glass or reflections of ourselves in the window. The thing was like a man in a gorilla suit, but with a dog head. It looked like a monster created for the movies. It didn't look like something nature would have thought to design. This thing had a look of fierceness about it that was most unnatural. Most animals, even predators, can do what they need to in order to survive. They can be brutal, they are formidable, and they are deadly, but they aren't evil. This thing exuded evil. It just seemed wrong. The night was not cold, and yet the breath of this Dogman came out in the form of steam. Not only that, but steam rose also off its bright red eyes that seemed like coals burning in the oven of its skull. The expression was manic and indignant, as though our very existence offended it. And then it did the thing that I still think of most when I think about this creature. It did the thing that got us out of bed in the first place. This Dogman roared. It was not a dog-like sound. Again, it was just wrong. It didn't belong there. I could tell it was real because it was making my ears hurt from the inside, judging by their reactions. The others found it horrible to hear as well. We ran back downstairs and locked the door behind us. I didn't really feel much safer down there. We huddled in the guest room that I was sleeping in, my old bedroom from when I was a kid. We just all sat together, kind of in shock. My mother began a stuttering apology to Vampirella, who interrupted her and told her to shove it. My father pointed to the window in my room that looked out onto the ground level of our backyard. There, standing right in front of the glass, were the two backwards bent legs of that demonic Dogman. It stood there for a while. Then we watched as the legs walked off towards the woods surrounding the house. The next day, the young shaman came over and we all talked about what happened for a long time. In his opinion, the Dogman had initially been seen on the edge of our property while my sister had become homesick after her separation from her guy. Once she had been formally invited back onto our property, the Dogman had been invited back as well. That wasn't what we wanted to hear, but it made sense on some level. We tried to deny it, because nobody wanted to blame old Vampirella, but it really seemed that the Dogmen were her issue, and for them to go away, she would have to be the one who made them go. The shaman offered to help her, but she just packed and left in a huff. I went home myself, since I had to get back to my job, which was located in the undisclosed location where I still live now. I have no idea what's happened to Vampirella since that time, but I know my father keeps tabs on her through his private eye. He and my mother have not yet complained about any more Dogman on or near the house, so I figure Vampy must be doing okay, at least for now. Then again, their eyesight isn't what it used to be, so maybe they're just not noticing the Dogman. I'm joking, of course. When that thing is around, even blind people know it. Why? Because of the intense roar of The Dogman, my sister accidentally summoned. Dogman and the stalled car. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I know a girl who's so cool that she's been banned by 2 different social media platforms just for her ideas. Actually, one of them let her back on, but she didn't apologize or sell out or anything. She's a real free thinker and one of the few people I've ever met who isn't full of it. But she told me stories that she can't share with the public. Stories about supernatural or paranormal things that have happened to her. And one of the stories involves a particularly stubborn and frightening Dogman. So my friend, let's call her Dora, because she's always exploring limits. Dora had a number of strange Fortean things happen to her. For one thing, she had seen a misty apparition that she assumed was a ghost. Another time, she felt invisible creatures in her home, and she wasn't sure if those were ghosts or not. She has seen lights in the sky pursuing her through the night. And then there's the story I'm about to tell you. Because of her outspoken nature, she already has a slew of philosophical opponents who call her crazy all day long. If she told these stories in public, her own supporters might start calling her bats as well. So she swore me to secrecy about all of this, and I'm not going to tell you anything more about her personal details to respect her privacy. One night, Dora was driving to some protest or event in some city, and her rented car started stalling out while she was driving down a long stretch of lonely country highway. She contacted her rental people and was waiting for the car service to drive out and rescue her, parked alongside of the highway by a dark, forbidding forest. Dora said she felt very vulnerable and frightened, intimidated and tiny next to the vast darkness surrounding her in every direction. She said she tried to imagine the same location in the daytime. With the bright sun out, this would probably be a very lovely and warm, friendly place to be parked in your car. She stretched and breathed deeper, trying to relax her body in the hopes that it would de-stress her mind. It wasn't working. She rolled her window down a little bit to listen to the sounds of the night. There were crickets and cicadas in every direction. There was a night owl hooting. Then there was a howl off in the distance, and Dora immediately rolled her window back up tight. She double-checked to see if all the doors were locked, and they were. It was just a matter of waiting this out. What could go wrong? That howl had set her imagination off. Were there wolves in this area? Coyote? Maybe roving bands of former house pets now gone feral? Those could be even more destructive than wild dogs. Sometimes they could take lives without even eating anything. They would do it for sport, like some humans. That sent a shudder through Dora, the idea of losing everything for nothing at all. She's the kind of person who would give her all for her convictions. She wants her passing to be in exchange for some boon to humanity. She wants her life to be spent making everyone else's lives just a little increment better. She didn't want to have all her years of sacrifice and opposition lead to a pack of dogs eating her car with her inside of it. Dora told me that sitting in that car alone in the dark started making her feel paranoid almost right away. First of all, no cars drove past her, as in not a single one. She kept her radio off as she wasn't in the mood for entertainment, and she wanted to hear every single noise happening around her. This was all too much like a scene from some 3D slasher flick from the 80s, and she was not in the mood to guest star in one of those kinds of pictures. But even the greatest among us are sometimes incapable of guiding our own destiny. Even the greatest among us are taken for rides outside of our own control or choosing. This particular night, Dora might have been physically sitting in the driver's seat, but it was the Dogman who controlled the steering wheel. Dora became aware that she was being watched long before she could isolate where that staring was coming from. She looked around on both sides of the street and didn't see anyone anywhere, but she could sure sense that someone was there. Maybe multiple someones, she couldn't be certain. It became increasingly unbearable, that feeling of being on display as though in a zoo. It made Dora feel vulnerable, as though a target had been placed on her. She was so weirded out that she slid over to the passenger seat and then slunk down to hide herself from being seen by anyone outside. It was kind of the equivalent of pulling the covers up over your head in bed when you're a kid. It might not actually protect you from anything, but at least you didn't have to see what was menacing you anymore. It was after ducking down that Dora heard activity outside her car. Not another car driving up, but someone walking around on the forest side of her car. Dora said she felt like she went ice cold and began shivering all over. She hugged herself to try to retain some body heat. The fear was so intense, it was shutting her system down. She could now hear someone brushing up against the car and walking all the way around it. She focused on making herself as small as possible and trying to hide in the shadows. She also kept her eyes shut like a child. If I can't see him, maybe he won't see me. She tried to tell herself that maybe it might be someone friendly. After all, just because he walked out of the forest doesn't mean he's evil. Maybe he's a hiker. Maybe he's a lost, eccentric millionaire. Maybe she had to look. She had to know. Dora's shivering had calmed down, and her curiosity had taken over. Who was out there? Whoever it was, he hadn't said a word. She was going to chance sticking her head up to take a peek. Of course, since this story was written by fate itself, just as she poked her head up, the person outside turned his head in her direction. They both got a fairly clear look at each other for about 1 second. Dara gasped at what she saw and pulled herself back down into the shadows. Her visitor, however, reacted differently. He screamed It sounded like a frightened dog's scream. Maybe there was a reason for that, as this particular man had a dog-like head. Maybe it wasn't a man at all. Maybe it was a dog, but a wide-chested one that stood tall, like a human. Maybe it was some kind of bear with a dog head and long legs. Whatever it was, it screamed again as if furious. It threw itself at the car the way an inebriated person might mess with a broken jukebox that played the wrong song. Dora stayed as small as she could make herself and watched from her hiding spot as the hairy, man-like dog thing threw its temper tantrum. She told me that she felt certain this was the end. She expected him to turn the car over, and she didn't expect that she would be rescued. She felt a wave of acceptance come over her that this might be her time to go. She saw that Dogman as some kind of archetype. There's a lesson for me here which I need to learn for my next incarnation, she thought. She was strangely calm, awaiting the inevitable. She knew it was going to be unpleasant, but she also knew that it would pass, as everything passes, in time. Dora could see the Dogman just wailing on the roof of her car, banging on her windows. He had cartoonishly large shoulder muscles. She had never seen anyone so pumped before. What kind of daily exertions must this thing be making to have grown so huge and massively muscular? And at least its top half, which was all she could see, was so human-like that she bet if you shaved him, that's exactly what he would resemble. But not his head. No, that was not human in any way. It wasn't primate or ape-like either. It resembled a dog mostly, especially in terms of its scary-looking teeth. It had the long snout of a dog, but the ears reminded her more of a deer's than a dog's. The eyes seemed evil and unlike any normal animal. I asked her what she meant when she said they looked evil, and she just shuddered and repeated the word, evil. Dora saw the Dogman make a crack in one of the rear side windows, and she braced herself for the end, which would now be coming soon. Except she watched the Dogman get lit with approaching headlights, and then she saw him disappear from her view. She climbed out from under the seat and was tremendously relieved to see that it was her rescuers from the rental agency. She rolled down her window a crack to speak to them, and they were very reassuring. She didn't say anything about the Dogman, which made her feel guilty, but she was afraid they would tell the cops she was crazy or on something and seeing werewolves. But while they worked, she kept a sharp eye out toward the dark woods. Would that thing come back now that there were two men there with her? She prayed that it wasn't that savage or crazy. As one of the men slammed her hood, he smiled at her through the windshield and told her she was good to go. Right directly behind him. She could see it. The Dogman. She could see its eyes peering out between the leaves of a tree. He was maybe 6 or 7 trees back into the woods, and he was watching everything that was happening. Maybe Dora's prayers superseded fate, or maybe this was just what was supposed to happen. But either way, she drove off into the night and was not bothered again by the Dogman. So the next time you disagree with some kind of activist and assume they live in an ivory tower and don't understand the real world, remember this story. Maybe they do know how the real world works. Maybe they're just afraid to come out and admit it. Hey, good news. We've got a 2-hour Dogman special coming out tomorrow featuring a really scary all-new story that you won't believe. Please be on the lookout for that tomorrow since we can't always count on the powers that be to send out notifications. Now, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with another all-new Dogman story right after this.
Hey there, do you like werewolf stories? Then join me, Nancy Livonian in Hollywood, every week for Werewolf Wednesdays right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel.
Dogman. On my neighbor's roof. Dear Scary Stories NYC. This story happened in the late 1990s when I was walking home from the commuter rail with my friend. He lived across the street from me in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and we both had gone into the city to have a fun day doing stuff. It was dark already as we walked home through the tree-lined, quiet streets to our houses. As we got to his house, we could clearly see humanoid figures on the dark roof of the building, walking around. We figured maybe his family was putting in a satellite dish or something, so we got closer to look. When we did so, though, we got the shock of our life. Those weren't people on his roof. Those were upright walking canines. They were dogmen. These looked like dogs in pretty much all ways, except for the way they moved around on their hind legs with their front paws held in front of them in a sort of praying position. Or maybe like they were begging, the way a dog will sit up and beg. Well, these were standing up and begging. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, but it matches descriptions I later read about in a book by Linda Godfrey. I would highly recommend reading anything she's written about Dogman if you want to understand the phenomenon. I saw this in Pennsylvania, yet it was essentially the same exact kind of thing she writes about people reporting up in Wisconsin. From a distance, they looked like strange men, but when you got closer, you could see they had long snouted noses. They had ears up on top of their heads. They even had tails. To me, an extra surreality was added to the scene, and that I had helped my friend's family fix that roof a summer or two earlier, and the angle it was at, it was just easier to crawl around on all fours getting up and down on that part of it. Even we as humans chose to hold on with our hands when moving around up there. So why were these naturally four-legged creatures standing on such a steep surface? It was really like imagery from a strange dream. Yet I remember this happening while I was awake and with my buddy, who saw the same thing I saw. We only saw this going on for maybe 30 seconds total, and the last 5 or 10 seconds close enough to see that these were not humans. The description of the memory takes much longer to tell than the actual witnessing itself. We both ran across the street to my family's house, and I couldn't open the door fast enough. We loudly alerted my parents, who were downstairs watching TV, that there were monsters on my friend's roof. We ran up to my room on the second floor. Our plan was to get a better view of the Dogman and maybe get a photograph taken from that vantage point. My parents called for us to stop running, while we shouted for them to come upstairs and see the Dogman. I wasn't sure any of us were hearing what the other was saying. We were all trying to be louder than the next guy. Well, my friend and I raced to my window, but already by then, you couldn't see anything on the roof across the street. It wasn't the angle I was thinking we'd be getting from there. We asked my sister if we could look out her window, and she did let us, but she gave us so much crosstalk that it really wasn't worth it. And we couldn't see anything more from her window either. So nobody in my family believed our story, and they acted grumpy with us. They told my friend to go home, but he was scared to. He called his parents first and told them what he had seen. They said the TV reception had been going in and out all night, and they thought all that noise from upstairs was his grandpa sleepwalking again. See, his parents instantly believed what he told them. They had no doubt it was Dogman. If their son told them, it was Dogman. My family, on the other hand, were and are skeptics. After their initial complete disbelief that anything had occurred at all, they graduated to saying it must have been bears on the roof. Nobody has ever known bears to go on people's roofs around here, so then the story changed to us seeing dogs on the roof and imagining they were up walking on their hind legs because we're such dumb jerks that we don't know what our eyes are showing us. They would stretch their imaginations past the breaking point rather than give me credit for being honest and sane. That's why I used to hang out at my friend's house a lot more than he would hang out at my house. It's a lot less stressful spending your day with people who respect you than it is spending your time around people who question every single thing you say. And that was a lesson taught to me by the Dogman. On my friend's roof, I'm Henry Lee Dogman, your feral and fearful host. Tonight, we've got a double-length scary story about one of my people, the North American nocturnal Dogman, or Dogmanus majorus blackie. Dim your lights, get your popcorn, and pull your covers up over your head, because we're about to tell you the story of the Swamp Boogery Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, when I was in my 20s, I spent almost 6 years working in real estate for 3 different companies. I was never very good at it, and am fortunate that I found a better line of work for me before I hit my 30s. The closest I came to succeeding in that business was when I worked for a boss who we can call Brenda, which was not her real name. She had a breathy kind of a voice, like a young Brenda Vaccaro. If you're too young to know who Brenda Vaccaro was, I guess Google her on YouTube. I was not, at the time, very much of a feminist, but Brenda was the alpha. Her sophistication and charm made her the omega, too. She was the first and the last, and you were happy to fill in the middle for her. A more inspiring and energizing boss I never had. She had us competing to do our best work while helping each other out, not competing against each other. She had a way of understanding how to make us all feel important and get the best work out of each of us. She also was a snappy dresser and intimidatingly good-looking, and I think even the straight women had a crush on her. In short, she was very beautiful and very likable. I don't know of her having any enemies in the business at all, but she probably would have gone to work charming them into loving her as much as the rest of us. I got sent out to scout a strip of land that the company wanted to handle the sale of. It was only swamp and forest land, but the location was right off a new highway about to be built. Brenda thought the property might be about to become valuable. She wanted me to look over the land and advise her about the possibility of the company actually purchasing the land itself. She felt there was a possibility for a huge profit, but obviously didn't want to invest a dime until someone had checked the place out. I felt honored that she had chosen me, but also frightened, since I wasn't the most experienced one. I wasn't really sure if I was qualified to judge if the land was worth buying. If I told her to get it, and it turned out to be worthless, that would be awful. On the other hand, if I told her to leave the property alone, and it turned into a gold mine, that would be just as awful in a different way. I'm not a religious man, but as I drove to that swamp on that day, I prayed for guidance and also a sign so that I would know what to do. By the time I reached the property in the late afternoon, the sun was beginning to turn the sky all kinds of colors. It somehow made the swamp seem far more melodramatic and foreboding than it might have been if the sky were blue. I pulled over and got out with my compass to walk through a bit of the land and get an idea of what was going on there. This was long before Google Maps. If you wanted street view back then, you walked down that street and you viewed it. So I walked into the forest and around some swamps. The sky was getting dark, and I had seen nothing but very wet, murky, muddy, and heavily forested scrubland. I could barely see the road where I'd parked my car behind me through the trees when I turned around to head on back. As I trudged through the foliage and slog, I had to pay attention to each footfall. It was hard to see, and there were many things to trip over and get stuck in. While I was so focused on my feet, with occasional glances up to make sure I was heading back in the direction of my car, I began to notice a kind of echo. It really sounded like each time one of my feet would squish into the mud, it would echo behind me in the forest. I hadn't noticed the echo on the way in, so it confused me. I decided to slow my pace and noticed that the echo continued at the same pace for a few seconds before it slowed down to match my new pace. I sped up as fast as I could, then stopped. The echoes got confused, then stopped. That wasn't my echo. It was someone trailing me from behind. I had just left a dirt road that was eventually going to be a highway, but was still now a dirt road. It was in the middle of nowhere. I had ventured further into the wilderness. Then, on my way back, someone was following me? How could that be possible? There was nothing behind me for miles, no city for an hour the way the crow flies. If someone was following me, where were they coming from? And what could their intention toward me possibly be? I turned and scanned the area, squinting into the dark woods. I saw my stalking friend move before he hid behind a tree. He hadn't expected me to stop and turn, so I had caught a decent glimpse of him for just 1 second. You'd be surprised how much detail you can make out in 1 second. You were wired this way so that you would have a chance to survive in nature. Your eyes and nervous system function so that in a glance you can determine whether a figure at a great distance is posing a potential threat to you or not. For instance, in this case, I saw the silhouette of a humanoid figure so tall that it would have made a basketball team, and so wide it could have played professional football, the American kind. It had tall ears on top of its head, like a dog or a deer or a kangaroo, and it had eye shine so bright it was nearly blinding. It had shaggy, curly fur. All other information was hidden by shadow, but my nervous system had gathered enough to put me into fight or flight mode. I I saw the creature was still behind the tree because it would peek out at me with its blinding and hellish eyes. I ran and fell over a log, then got up and tripped on a vine, and got up and kept running. I no longer looked behind, as it no longer mattered what the creature was doing. I either got back to my car before it grabbed me, or I didn't. When I flung my mud-covered, bruised self into the driver's seat and slammed and locked my door, only then did I look out the window toward the forest to see if I was still being chased. I shouldn't have looked. I should have just put the keys in the ignition and driven away. But I'm only human, and I had to know, so I looked, and I saw the thing emerging from the bushes. There was a lot more ambient light out by the road than there was in the dark forest, so I could make out a whole lot more detail now than I could before. This was a really, really nasty-looking monkey dog. This thing looked as strong as a chimp, which is far stronger than a man, but it looked like a rabid dog at the same time. The head was more like that of a dog than anything else I could compare it to. It was barking at me and growling, baring its teeth, and yet it stood on its hind legs, which were massive and monstrous. I dropped the car keys in my nervousness, and the creature began to walk toward my vehicle. I was weeping as I bent down to feel around for the keys. It was hard to control my hands. I was shaking so much from fear. When I finally got the key and I finally stuck it in, I could hear the beast barking outside. I just turned the ignition and hit the gas, and only then began lifting my head to see what direction I was driving in. I corrected our path with the steering wheel and drove away from that swamp in the way a zombie would drive. Although the tears kept pouring out of my eyes for most of the drive home, I think I was in a temporary state of shock and had sort of fallen back on autopilot. I blanked out most of the trip home as a consequence. The next day, I found myself strongly urging Brenda that she should avoid having anything to do with that land, but I never was able to sufficiently explain to her why I felt so strongly about it. Obviously, I didn't put anything in my report about a dog-headed werewolf creature from hell that stalked me and chased me off the land, and none of the other issues I listed seemed important to her. If someone wanted a business along the new highway, they could fill in the swamp a bit and get started building. As far as Brenda was concerned, nothing I had said had deterred her from the idea that snapping up this land right away would lead to big profits for her and the company later on. Even after she made this clear to me, I still begged her to avoid the land. I knew nothing good could come of it, but I couldn't figure out how to convince her of this. Telling her I saw a monster was definitely out of the question. So it reached a point where Brenda decided to drive out to the location with me in her passenger seat. I was horrified. I didn't want to be going back to that swamp. My hands were sweaty, and I found myself shivering. When we finally reached the location, it was another brightly colored and dramatic sunset. Brenda pulled the car off the road and opened her door. I stopped her from leaving and decided to just tell her the truth. "Look, Brenda," I began, "there's something living out there." She stared at me blankly. "There's something living in these swamps? that isn't going to take well to people building businesses on its land. Brenda laughed out loud, thinking I was joking around. I insisted I was serious, but she had already gotten out and slammed the door behind her. The ground is a bit muddy here, but it's not a huge deal, she said out loud. I insisted that as soon as we hit the tree line, she'd see the area was so muddy that it was practically underwater. Brenda went toward the darkness and the woods anyway. Of course she did. Unlike me, she feared nothing. And so, we walked into the woods, and I immediately heard the sounds. You know which sounds. The sounds of that thing with the tall ears that growls. They were soft and at a distance, but they were there. Brenda must have heard them too, but maybe just didn't have a context to place them in, so she ignored them. Or maybe she didn't hear them at all, because she didn't know she should be listening for anything like that. I heard her talking about something related to the real estate business and the usefulness of the land, but my focus was on searching the woods for those glowing eyes. Before I could triangulate what direction the subtle growling was coming from, Brenda gave out an exasperated cry. I looked in her direction and saw that she was looking at me with worry and grabbing at one of her legs. My eyes followed from her eyes down to her arms, holding her calf beneath her skirt, and further down, past her ankle, to her little, high-heeled booty. It was entirely sunken into the mud and making splooshing noises. From the way she was looking at me, I imagined the words she was currently speaking must have to do with me helping her extricate her foot from the mud. Before heading in her direction, I made one final visual sweep of the area from my extreme right, furthest away from my boss, to my direct left, where she was trapped by the terrain. And immediately before my eyes came back to rest on Brenda, I saw it spill out of the bushes and into view. It was that same Dogman with the tall ears, or else it was a very similar looking creature. The sun was not entirely down, and its eyes were not exhibiting the eyeshine effect. They appeared to be dark brown or black, dog-like eyes, and they were open very wide, creating a crazy-looking expression on the animal's face. It gave the impression of being a villain from an old silent movie. Its posture and the way it held its claws in front of it reminded me of poses I'd seen on the Edison Frankenstein and the original Nosferatu. But this Dogman wasn't intending to kidnap Brenda and tie her to the railroad tracks while it twirled its mustache. And whatever it was intending, I hoped I could manage to keep from happening. I raced to my boss, and I wanted to help, but I wasn't sure exactly how. She directed me where to hold her and told me when to pull. We both pulled, and the Dogman took a step closer to us, baring its teeth and growling. It was harder to do as Brenda asked because my hands were sweating and I was growing nervous like the last time. This is why I told you not to deal with this property, I said to Brenda, stuttering from nerves. Do you understand now why I couldn't really explain? Before she could answer, I heard a popping sound and Brenda fell backward on top of me. I would have let her take her time getting up, as it wasn't the most unpleasant place in the world to be, but the sudden action of us falling had apparently alarmed the tall-eared Dogman. It barked loudly like a guard dog spying a burglar, except this was the biggest, scariest guard dog of all time. I saw that Brenda was barefoot on one foot, or in her stocking feet, I guess would be the correct terminology. That was when I noticed that her boot was still almost completely embedded in the mud. I reached toward it, but the Dogman grew more loudly agitated when I did, and Brenda told me to leave it. She whispered to me that I should carry her back to the car. I had never carried a person before, so she had to direct me how to pick her up. I had her in my arms in front of me, and I started walking backward, with Brenda looking over my shoulder to guide me. I stared in the general direction of the Dogman, careful not to look it in the eyes, but watching it intently with my peripheral vision. It seemed to be holding its position and allowing us to leave. We kept up a slow pace and made it about a dozen steps backward when my arms gave out. I've never been much of an athlete. Brenda must have weighed all of 92 pounds, but I was just not in shape and I dropped her. Once my boss's pretty bottom hit bottom, that Dogman freaked out, as in he began barking, snarling, snapping at the air, and worst of all, heading in our direction. Fast. I just remember diving into the car and Brenda starting the engine. She must have run there one shoe on and one shoe off. Brenda pulled away while I pulled my legs into the car. Through the flapping open passenger seat door, I watched as the feral Dogman raced bipedally toward us, its fur blowing in the breeze, its mouth opened wide, exposing prehistoric-looking rows of fangs, and its eyes opened wider than the mouth. It was the one moment in my life where time slowed to a standstill. I still have a clear memory of every aspect of what I saw in that 1 second, as it was the most intense moment I've ever personally experienced. In that moment in time, I didn't know if what I was looking at was about to get left in the dust as a memory, or if what I was looking at was about to catch up with Brenda's car and make mincemeat out of the both of us. It was this honest, open moment where anything could happen, where I was simultaneously marveling at the magnificent creature in front of my eyes, while I was calculating its speed relative to ours to estimate if Brenda and I were going to still be alive the next day. I don't know what it was that we had done, but that creature absolutely hated us. As we drove off, I looked in its manic eyes. They were communicating indignation, fury, rage, and abhorrence, but they were so wide open that they also communicated fear and great alarm. We were something horrible to that Dogman, and it wanted us to leave and to never come back. It had made that clear to me the last time, and yet there I was, intruding on its home turf all over again. I told Brenda I could never go back to that place, even if I were paid $1 million to do so. Brenda bought the land, assigned someone besides me to handle it, and she was right. It turned a huge profit for her and the company. She went on soon to much bigger and better things, and my next boss fired me for incompetence. They did the same with a few other people who had done great jobs under Brenda, but had been struggling under the new leadership. Years and years passed, and about 6 weeks ago I was driving from one place to another, and I got this weird feeling of deja vu. All of a sudden, I felt guilty, and I realized I was about to drive through that area with the swamp and the Dogman. I felt badly for intruding on his land for a third time. As I came around the bend, I saw all the stores and shops and fast food places that Brenda had built there years earlier. The place was still thriving alongside the now decades-old highway. Where there used to be danger, there was now a Chuck E. Cheese. No more wilderness. No more mythological swamp forest with Jungian archetypes haunting our nightmares and dreams. And most of all, no more swamp boogery. Dogman.
I'm Madeline Starr, and you can join me here each week for Saturday Night Scary Serials. That's when we tell you a new chapter in the ongoing serialized life of Jenny, whose husband Brian turns into a large feral dogman that only she can control. Why is this happening to them? And who are the strange, partially hidden forces that seem to guide them along a path they never chose? Come back every Saturday night as I host another episode of Saturday Night Scary Serials right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel.
Werewolf movie fan meets real life Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, okay, here I am writing you the story that you asked me to write you. Remember, the agreement is that you in no way reveal who I am, not even by hinting in any way in the introduction or the video description or anything. I just want you to say the title and then read my letter, and I don't want you to add any cute in-jokes so that people can figure it out or solve the riddle of who I am or any of that. All the viewers need to know is that I'm a person writing you this email that you're going to read on your show. In fact, if you want to tell them it's fiction, that's fine with me. As long as I never have a person walk up to me at a convention and ask if I'm the one who wrote this story, then I'm fine with your handling of it. Nobody would believe you anyway, since everyone who knows me knows that I'm such a fan of movie werewolves. If they heard me tell my story of seeing a real-life dogman, they would all just laugh and think I was being entertaining. I'm going to tell you what actually happened to me, but I'd probably even prefer it if you didn't believe any of it. Since I was very young, I loved monster movies, and my favorite of the human-sized monsters was the Wolfman, as portrayed by Lon Chaney in the old Universal horror films. I was also a huge fan of any other werewolf movie I could find, from the precursor to Chaney called The Werewolf of London to the cheaply made Werewolf of Washington. I had seen as many as I was capable of seeing. I even watched Paul Naschy's werewolf movies in Spanish with no subtitles, just to see the monster scenes. Back then, a werewolf in a movie was a guy with a lot of hair glued to his face and hands, wearing a ripped shirt. Then, in the 80s, things began to change. Wolfen, an American Werewolf in London, introduced or reintroduced the idea of humans turning into actual wolves, although in the case of American Werewolf, it was a giant and animatronic one. The American Werewolf walked on all fours. I enjoyed that movie greatly and went to see it 4 or 5 times in the theater. In the original Lon Chaney Wolfman movie, he is supposed to have been bitten by something he saw as a large wolf, and that turned him into the werewolf afterward. Why, when he turned, he changed into a guy wearing Jack Pierce makeup, but when Bela Lugosi changed earlier in the same movie, he became a stunt wolf, I never understood. American Werewolf was the first movie I saw to have the human character turn into a makeup man-created creature that was also a quadruped wolf. Soon after that, movies like The Howling introduced what most of us now think of when we use words like werewolf or dogman. That is, the monster is a man in a suit, yes, but it's a larger-than-life, incredibly tall and strong human-wolf hybrid shaped like a hairy upright primate with long sharp claws and a dog or wolf-like head full of long sharp Ginsu knife teeth. That movie was made in 1981, but it changed people's minds about what werewolves looked like. Before that, as far as I'm aware, the only creatures in myth and popular imagination who had human-like bodies and wolf or dog-like heads were the Egyptian Anubis and the Catholic Saint Christopher. I'm sure there are others I'm either forgetting or unaware of, but I think you get my point. Werewolves in the American zeitgeist didn't have dog heads before 1981. When the Dogman craze happened in Michigan, the home movie that went around purporting to show the Dogman didn't show a dog-headed predator walking upright. It showed a guy in a ghillie suit running on all fours. The cultural moment in time when Dogman and werewolves were psychologically melded together in the collective unconscious, at least in my opinion, was when Linda Godfrey wrote her first book, The Beast of Bray Road. Dogman started as a large man-sized dog, and the Wolfman started, at least in the 20th century United States, as a hairy man running around on his tiptoes. Both of them morphed in the public imagination into hairy, man-shaped beasts with dog heads and glowing eyes, emanating unnatural levels of fear in those who witness them. So it's interesting when I talk to people of different ages, from different places, and they each have very different ideas of what a dogman or a werewolf is, and whether they are related things or very different. I spent all of my life before my sighting studying these related subjects as a hobby, although it was a very serious hobby. Whenever I talked to someone who claimed to have seen a dogman in real life, I would ask them what werewolf movies they had seen and that sort of thing. I assumed that the person's cultural background dictated what kinds of monsters they had witnessed since then. As an urban intellectual, I was certain that I knew that werewolves do not actually exist. My sighting happened as unexpectedly as everyone else's sighting. I did not think of what was happening as a quote-unquote dogman sighting while it was happening, nor did I think of the creature or creatures in question as werewolves. I thought I was dealing with humans at first, and only after the creature revealed itself to me did I have to accept that this couldn't possibly be the case. Enough backstory. Here is what happened to me. We were holding a very private screening for several potential investors at a big old house out in the middle of nowhere. The easiest way to get to this place was to follow a dirt road leading off a 2-lane blacktop, but the road was easy to miss, especially in the darkness. For that reason, we were taking turns standing guard duty on the road by the highway, holding up a coded sign that only the invited guests would understand each time cars went by. Very few cars went by, I'll say that much, so my mind wandered. It was almost hypnotic, watching all the stars twinkle and the leaves rustle in the breeze, the unending chirping of crickets in my ears. I was really enjoying the peacefulness of it. Maybe that's why I noticed a very slight noise in the woods that I might not have noticed on most other nights. I figured I would hear a car coming for a while before I needed to go get my sign up, so I estimated that I could risk walking over to the woods to investigate that noise. As I grew closer, I became more and more confused about what I was listening to. The sound continually changed, and I couldn't really identify what it was, until all of a sudden, I could. I froze in my tracks. It was a canine. It was an angry, wild canine of some sort. Or it was one of my partners messing with me. I decided to walk back to my post and do my job instead of bothering the local predators when I missed my first step, landing my foot on a smooth rock and twisting my ankle just a bit. It was painful enough that I let out a soft sound like an ouch or whatever. I immediately noticed that the dog sounds behind me had ceased and were replaced with the sounds of bushes and trees being pushed out of the way. I was on the ground nursing my ankle, and then the face of a feral dog appeared between branches it was pushing apart. The thing is, I had to look up to see this face. Granted, I was on the floor, but that face had to have been at least 6 feet up, probably higher. I honestly feel like I was seeing a 7-foot tall monster. But I was scared, I was surprised, in pain, lying on the dirt, and possibly my fear exaggerated the thing's size. I gasped and began doing that thing where you try to crawl away sideways. It doesn't really work, especially if your ankle hurts, so I set about standing up. This was a painful process, and I was not watching the creature during my struggle to get back up. When I was once again standing, and I looked back at the feral dog, it had moved out of the bushes, and I could now see it in its entirety. This was not something that I had ever seen before, either in real life or in mythology or fiction. In front of me stood a mastiff. It was so specifically a mastiff it was absurd, and yet this mastiff, unlike any mastiff in recorded human history, was standing on its hind legs. It looked as absurd as it did terrifying. The entire scene froze me with a sense that this was something impossible happening. It was frightening, in part just because it couldn't possibly be real, and frightening in the other sense that this thing might pose some form of physical danger to me. The thing appeared top-heavy, but its legs were strong, and it stood and walked steadily and with an air of confidence. The eyes reflected the available light so brightly that they almost seemed to glow. The jowly mastiff face appeared to regard me the way a rich man would regard the next course in his evening meal. I guessed that he would be able to outrun me with my injured ankle, so it would make no sense to make a run for it. I noticed at that point that this mastiff had paws that resembled a raccoon's paws on steroid more than the paws of a dog. This was some kind of hybrid monster, or else a man in a truly remarkable costume. If these were live effects, the creator should get a backer and make their own werewolf pictures. I've worked in the business my entire life, and I've never, ever seen a werewolf or really any kind of monster that looked as good as what I was staring at from the dirt on that night. I noticed that, although horrifying to see and quite apparently a carnivore, this Dogman was looking at me with almost as much curiosity as I was looking at it. It didn't seem to have decided yet if I was his dinner or a fellow traveler. I decided to press my advantage on that score. I rose to my feet slowly, trying to hide how badly my ankle hurt. Facing away from the beast, I regained my composure and held in the urge to shout out in pain. When I had caught my breath, I took a step away and listened. The monster seemed to be holding its position, so I took a tiny second step. This one was on the ankle that hurt, so I winced silently. If I kept walking very, very slowly, it might not become apparent that I was walking with a limp. I felt as though running from the werewolf would cue him in that I was prey, and displaying an obvious limp would essentially do the same thing. Walking away in a casual manner slowly might be the best path to safety. If I acted bored, maybe the Dogman would as well. I took 3 or 4 more steps and heard nothing behind me. Then I made a mistake, and one that could easily have proved to be fatal. I turned around to see if the Dogman was still there. He was, but his expression was no longer curious. For some reason, this time when I looked at him, he appeared deeply offended that we two had made direct eye contact. He seemed to be taking it as a challenge, and I saw all of his teeth, with saliva oozing out from between them and onto the dirt ground. He was making a kind of a growling sound that reminded me somehow of Renfield from the original Dracula movie. He sounded extremely unhappy, and as though his agitation were growing. I dropped my eyes to the ground and I stopped walking. I tried to assume a non-threatening pose, but held to my spot. I saw the werewolf approaching, and I could smell him now. It was a heavy musk, and I nearly choked on the foul odor. I looked down at the creature's approaching feet and saw that he had his claws out. They were like dog feet, but with larger pads, and the legs were as thick as young tree trunks. The creature walked right up to within a few feet of me, making its unhappy growling noise. I tried to hold still and act nonchalant and unafraid, but I had already flooded my cheeks with tears, and I was shaking a bit, entirely out of my own control. I could feel the tickling sensation of the dog leaning down to sniff the top of my head. I held still and tried not to wriggle. I had no chance to escape using speed, so my only choice was to let him smell me and act like I was cool with it. He might eat me for dinner anyway, but if I displayed fear, then he definitely would. The creature smelled my shoulder, then came down, and soon I was having my eyeballs smelled by massive and powerful canine nostrils. I closed them out of fear that I might accidentally make eye contact with the great monster again and get him angry all over. It smelled my mouth. It smelled my neck. It smelled my crotch. I had to remain perfectly still as sweat dripped down every part of my body, tickling me in every location. I felt like I wanted to faint. Any second, I might begin to suffer a most horrible fate, and every atom of my being was telling me to get out of there, but I could do absolutely nothing at all. When the Dogman moved all the way down to smell my feet, I was so relieved that he hadn't bitten me yet that the world began spinning around me. I saw stars as verbs, and the trees seemed to be dancing. I was having a hard time keeping it together, and the majority of me was voting that we all take a nap right then and there. It took a lot of willpower to remain standing up. I looked down at the creature smelling my feet and saw twigs and garbage tangled in its back fur. This wasn't someone in a costume, and it wasn't a werewolf in the traditional sense. It was an animal that lives in the forest 24/7. It just wasn't one that anyone in their right mind thought would actually exist in real life. Like I said earlier, while this was happening, I wasn't thinking, oh, finally I'm seeing a werewolf or a dogman in real life. I was thinking, this mastiff is giant and bipedal. My ankle hurts. I wonder if the combination of those two facts will prove to be my undoing. It didn't look like any kind of thing I'd heard being described as a werewolf or dogman leading up to that point, and I didn't think I was seeing a Jungian archetype, since this didn't look to me to be similar to any mythological creature I was then, or am now, aware of. I thought I was seeing some new kind of animal, some new mutant breed of mastiff, and I was wondering if I was going to come out of this meeting in one piece. At that point, the dogman stood up to its full height, well over my head. It looked off in the distance, down toward the 2-lane blacktop. Almost magically fast, that werewolf thing whooshed back into the forest and out of my line of vision. As it left, I could hear a car approaching from the direction it had looked. That was my cue to start limping as quickly as I could back toward my spot where I needed to hold up my sign. It was, in fact, one of the potential investors showing up. I was so glad to see him and thought of him as my savior. In true show business fashion, he and I later got involved in lawsuits, and now we both shun each other. But still, I have to admit that on that one particular night, he saved me from who knows what. Sometimes I tell people this story, but never before 3 a.m., and never with someone that I think will repeat it. The one time it started going around in the business that I claimed to have seen a real werewolf, I made a joke out of it and everyone thought it was just a fun gag, not a genuine sighting of an anomalous creature. In fact, to be honest, the people I know either like werewolf movies or believe in cryptids. Mostly the believers don't like the werewolf movies and the movie fans don't believe in real monsters. Maybe that's different where you live, but among the people I know, that's how it goes. It just doesn't make much sense for me to tell the story seriously, as it would definitely cause me to lose some good paying work. So that's why I don't mind if you tell people I was joking when I sent you this email. And I don't mind if nobody thinks this werewolf movie fan is serious when I say that on one night in time, I actually came face to snout with a living, breathing, feral, giant dogman. Dandelion Dogman. When I was young, I used to visit my grandmother in her home out in the rural country for up to 2 weeks at a time over the summer and sometimes Christmas breaks. She was my father's mother, and apparently they trusted her with me or needed a vacation from being my parents so badly that they just didn't care if I was safe or not. You see, my grandma's place might not have been the safest place for a kid to stay, because she used to do things to deliberately attract the dogman. Well, mainly only one specific thing. She would brew dandelion tea. Somehow the creature would always know when she did, and he would come closer while the tea brewed and steeped, at least according to her. I could smell it if I was in the very close vicinity, but that creature had to have a far greater sense of smell than any human. Now you might be asking yourself why anyone would perform any action at all once they discovered that said action drew the attention of a man-sized predator like the Dogman. And to explain that, I'll have to backtrack a bit into Grandma's history, or what I know of it. I only ever heard her version of events after all, so I'm sure the story must be a bit biased. Grandma was a great woman, but she was human, so I have little doubt there must be exaggerations or misinterpretations mixed into the history. Grandma was the youngest of 7 daughters, but she was the oldest when she got married, 29. That might sound young by modern standards, but back then it was not. She and her husband only had 1 child, and that would have been my father. Women were generally not able to bear children as long back then as they are today, so it was a relief to her family that she was able to marry to a solvent man with a job in a bank and have a healthy son. Grandma would get wistful talking about her husband. She clearly loved him very deeply. She once told me that I was only the 2nd person she had ever met that she could talk to for hours, the other, of course, being my grandpa. He passed away before I was born, suddenly in his 40s, which was young even for back then. He left her very well provided for, though, as she moved herself and my father out to the country, buying that same cottage that I would visit her at so many years later. What does all this have to do with Dogman, I hear you asking mentally? Don't worry, I'll get to it. When Grandpa was alive, one of his favorite treats was when Grandma would make her dandelion tea. It was something they shared a love of, and something that kept them tightly bonded to each other. They had many fine conversations over the steam rising off the dandelion tea, and the smell of it would bring his memory back to life for Grandma. And as you already know, that wasn't the only thing it would bring back. Grandma first realized she had an old werewolf man living in the woods near her one day when she sat looking out her back window and enjoying some of her homemade tea. She could see it in the trees, cautiously surveying her property and studying its surroundings. Grandma told me that the tea is a favorite of the werewolves, and I thought she meant it like a funny tagline. I thought she was just joking around to get me to drink it. She knew I liked monster movies, so I just thought it was one of those things adults say. But one time when I was out there, we were having a conversation and eating vanilla cookies with her tea, and a sound outside distracted her from what I was saying. She hushed me and beckoned that I should follow her. Grandma led me down a flight of stairs to a window in the back wall of the stairwell. She stood there on her tiptoes for a while, looking through until she seemed to spot whatever it was she was looking for. Then, I remember her holding me up so I could look out as well, and I saw the backyard, and I saw the trees beyond it. I didn't understand what was going on, and her arms weren't strong enough to hold me up for very long. So she put me down and went upstairs to find me a stepladder. By the time she was able to bring the ladder back and set it up, even she couldn't see anything outside any longer. When I quizzed her what that was all about, Grandma told me that she heard the Dogman outside, and then she spotted him in the tree line. She wanted to share it with me. I wondered if she was joking, if she was crazy, or if there really was a dog-headed hairy man walking around and I just didn't know where to look when she held me up. I was kind of leaning toward crazy, but I didn't want to rule out the other choices, as technically they were both possible, and it would have stunk if my grandma was Looney Tunes. I wanted her to be sane, so I wanted her to either tell me she was joking, or I wanted that Dogman to be very real in a very deep way. She was one of the people I cared about the most, and she was the adult I depended on the most after my parents. So, as a kid, I had a lot at stake emotionally in the idea that werewolves might be real. I never did see a werewolf back then at Grandma's house, although I don't think we shared her dandelion tea very many times after that. I do think she kept drinking it, though, as we found a supply there after she passed. My wife and I had to clean up her house and figure out what to do with her belongings. While we took a break one evening while packing and listing everything, I told my wife the story of the dandelion tea that allegedly attracted a real, living werewolf. My wife had this expression on her face that must have been similar to mine when I was first told about it by my grandmother. I don't think she could tell if I was serious or joking. Nevertheless, my wife really wanted to brew some of it. She said that if the story was true, then this would be our last chance to ever drink the tea at that location where the Dogman was alleged to live. I guess it was her jovial attitude about it that got me to lower my defenses and my fears to set about brewing us a pot of Grandma's dandelion tea. We sat down, and I ceremoniously poured out 2 cups, handing one to my wife. "To real werewolves," my wife said, smiling. We clinked our cups together and took a sip in unison. Right at that moment, I swear to you, came the sound of a dog howling outside. I did a spit take like in an old comedy movie. My wife laughed, thinking I was joking, but I wasn't. I almost choked. The dog howl had surprised me so much. My wife asked me how I did that, how I made that sound happen. She thought it was some joke I was playing on her. Nervously, I went to one of the windows in that room and peered outside. Wow, it had really gotten dark fast. I wanted us to go home immediately, and yet, the idea of going out in the dark and walking across the long front lawn to where our car was parked suddenly seemed a frightening idea. "That howl sounded really close," I said, and I walked to the back of the house and down that one flight of steps. There, in that stairwell, I was now tall enough to look out the window onto the backyard, so I walked up and peered out, and 2 feral animal eyes looked right back at me. I screamed, and outside I could hear barking and growling. It sounded like a wild animal out there, and it sounded like a big one. I ran upstairs and grabbed my wife's arm. I told her we had to leave, and fortunately she didn't doubt that I meant it. She must have heard those angry dog sounds too. We ran through the house to the front and opened the door, spilling outside frantically. Before we could even close the door behind us, we saw it. Coming around from the back of the house to the front, there was a creature that wandered out of somebody's nightmare. Some people think Dogman is a natural animal living in the forests of North America. You have a right to feel that way if you want, but what I saw looked like something created by mad scientists, or maybe something that walked out of an ancient Greek or Native American myth. This thing walked like a man, but was clearly not human. It had a sleek, angular version of a wolf-like head, and it looked not just angry, but outright evil. It seemed almost cartoonish in that sense, as though every part of it had been designed to seem threatening to any who saw it or heard it in the vicinity. It was as though a Hollywood team of geniuses had gotten together to design the most evil and horrifying character possible. The way it walked reminded me a bit of the creature from 20 Million Miles to Earth that was animated by Ray Harryhausen. It didn't have a tail, but the way it walked reminded me more of that than any natural animal. Maybe that's why, to me, it seemed like something from another planet or reality that got left here by accident. Needless to say, we ran inside and double-locked the front door. Then, we went through the entire home, closing and locking every window and door. We didn't see the creature or hear it any more that night, but it was hard for us to sleep anyway. I felt as though the thing had never left, so I was jumpy and I couldn't get much sleep. It might have left hours earlier, but I was finding it impossible to get my nervous system out of fight or flight mode until I was out of that house and all the way home. Neither of us stayed there after 3 or 4 in the afternoon from then on, and we never brewed Grandma's dandelion tea ever again. When she used to make the tea and see the Dogman, Grandma somehow related it to her lost husband, who I had never met. She was in a strange way comforted by the visits from the beast. But when my wife and I tried to brew some of the same tea after her passing, we were met with a very unhappy and hostile reaction by the dandelion Dogman, the deciduous Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once encountered a Dogman. Well, actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. It was really terrifying and frightening in a different way from any other kind of being scared. It still stands out as one of the most horrifying things that ever happened to me. And yet, at the same time, I learned never to feel hopeless or defeated that day when I came face to face with the creature I now call the deciduous Dogman. This happened in my young adulthood when I was in my early 20s. My then girlfriend and now wife, who we can call Martha, had a younger sister who she would try to convince me that we should double date with. Her sister liked macho kind of guys, whereas Martha and I were very nerdy at the time. I suppose we're still somewhat nerdy, now that I think about it. Anyway, one night Martha coerced me into going on a double date with her during a period where her sister was dating a hyper-competitive, macho dude we can call Boris, because he was so boring. No offense to any of you Borises out there, I'm sure you're all very interesting. This guy wasn't. Anything I said or did, he felt a desperate need to have to top. He had to be better than me at everything, which was hard for a guy with muscles for brains, who was also 3 or 4 years younger than I was. So it was a tedious evening as we ate dinner at a diner together. Afterward, we drove to a dark, forested place we knew we'd have some privacy in to do what young adults tend to do. They had the back seat while Martha and I had the front. Finally, her sister's date was focused on his girlfriend instead of on competing with me. I remember I needed to go into the woods at one point to do my BI business. On any other night, I would have walked behind the first big tree and done what needed to be done, but as I entered those woods, I swore I thought I could hear someone coming up behind me. I figured it was Annoying Man and that he would be trying to compete with me even in my private moments, so I wandered a bit deeper into the darkness to get further away from him. I had a hard time doing my business because I can't do it if I think people are looking at me. After a while, nature won out, and a very relieved version of me prepared to walk back to the car and resume my canoodling. The sound of a twig snapping halted my motion and set my entire body on alert. Was it the stupid guy? No. There, through the trees in front of me, I could see what looked every bit like a man wearing an elaborate Hollywood werewolf costume. I gasped in shock, and that thing turned quickly to look in my direction. I dropped to the ground to hide, and I crawled over to a boulder and hid behind that. Peering over the rock, I saw the creature again. It wasn't as tall as a fully grown man, but it was tall, maybe 5 feet. It was definitely a dog, but it was walking on its hind legs. It didn't look as though its front paws were injured, as I could occasionally make them out through the foliage. It held its paws in front, as though begging, and it walked in a very sure-footed kind of way on its hind legs. It did not skip along like a dog trained to do a stupid pet trick. It stomped around in an aggressive sort of way. I couldn't see below its chest, so I can't tell you how humanoid or dog-like its lower half was. I just never got that information. All I know is it was angry, and it was fierce. The creature had brown fur that was very, very short. It reminded me of a beagle, but it was a solid color, and it was the angriest looking beagle I'd ever seen. Some animal behind me made a noise in the forest, and the beast turned to glare in my direction. That was when I got the best view of its face from the front. Its snout was long like a dog's is, but the teeth it bared as it growled in my direction reminded me more of a cow's or a human's teeth than a dog's. They were not thin, long fangs. They were wide, stumpy teeth. This fact didn't make me feel any less concerned, though. The beast was large enough that I felt it could probably manage to defeat me in a physical contest. With those teeth, just fine. I have to say, this was not only one of the scariest moments of my life, but it affected me emotionally in a surprising way. I felt so sad and so sorry for myself that there was this 5-foot-tall beast between me and my car and my girlfriend. My eyes teared up, and I just wanted to cry. I remember the tears were actually rolling down my cheeks as I tried to sob as quietly as possible. It was a moment that called for bravery and heroism, but I was falling to pieces in self-pity instead. I remember thinking stuff about how, oh, it wasn't fair, and oh, I had so much to live for, and things of that nature. I automatically accepted my own doom just because I had a roadblock tossed in my way. In fairness to me, that roadblock was a feral dogman, so it's not like I wasn't actually in threat of physical danger. What happened next taught me that no matter how bad you think your life is, it can always get a whole lot worse. From the forest to my right, I heard crunching gravel and branches being moved out of the way. The dogman apparently heard this as well. We both looked toward the same direction, and we both witnessed a truly awesome sight. Another dogman. This one, almost twice as tall as the first, emerged from the foliage and into partial view. The 5-foot-tall one had to look up to see this one after it came close, and they appeared to be engaging in some sort of bonding ritual. While I could see the face of the shorter one, the taller one had to lean down to interact. I could make out her torso area, and I say her because this was definitely a female of the species. With her being so much taller than the original monster, I assumed she had to be its mother. I saw her bending down to groom the 5-foot-tall brown dogman, and her teeth were long, thin, sharp, and dagger-like. Nothing at all like the teeth of the smaller one. I realized the 5-foot-tall dogman must still be very young. Probably those were still its deciduous teeth, its milk teeth. All of this was overwhelming, and I sobbed ever harder in utter self-pity. I inhaled a bit too loudly one time, and both beasts turned their attention toward me with lightning-fast quickness. I was a goner, and I knew it. Just then, I heard a most unexpected sound. My girlfriend, Martha. She was calling for me. Soon, she was joined by her sister and her sister's annoyed-sounding boyfriend. The two Dogman went on alert, surveying the scene approaching them from the car, and bolted off to my right. I raced out of that forest, neglecting to wipe the tears from my face before I did so. Then, I endured lots of ribbing from the boyfriend, while I hugged Martha, and I just cried. I drove everybody home then. It was my car, so I got to decide when the evening's fun was complete. I didn't tell any of them what happened while I was in the trees that night, and only told my girlfriend years later, after she was my wife. There would have been nothing to gain but a lot to lose by talking about it to Boris or her sister back then. Because of my experience, I tend to think that Dogman must be some sort of real animal out there. I could be wrong, I suppose, as it was dark, and I never saw the bottom halves of the apparent monsters. Maybe they were people in costumes or something like that. Maybe I imagined it somehow, I don't know. But if what I saw was actually happening in front of me, then we can assume that Dogmen have different stages of growth. They start smaller, with milk teeth, and they grow larger, eventually becoming apex predators. If they were supernatural or paranormal, this all might not be so. Even though it's been decades since it happened, I still think back all the time to the night when I saw the deciduous Dogman.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.